The iron gate crashed back against its hinges as Elias Morton shoved through, rain spattering his collar and his lantern flaring once, then guttering to black. He swore under his breath and shouldered the gate. Footsteps, hard and measured, answered him on the gravel. "Who goes there?" a voice called. Elias lifted his hand and showed the empty lamp socket. Suspicion drove him forward, and his voice came out steady. "Elias Morton." A poor man seeking night's shelter. Within 5 steps Thomas Harcus stood in the doorway of the lodge, a battered lantern at his belt and a mouth that made no invitation. He filled the path with his bulk and the rain ran from his cap. "You bring trouble at this hour, Mr. Morton, Thomas," he the name with a grunt, watching Elias' wet sleeve. Elias felt the rules settle into him as surely as cold water on skin. He had come asking shelter and immediately met denial. Elias pushed his soaked hat back. "I need a room for the night. My coach broke on the lane. I travel light. I paid what coin I had." Thomas did not move to open the gate. He watched the silhouette of the manor on the hill, then back at Elias. He moved as if to step aside and then kept his place. "You know the house after moonrise, Mr. Morton. We keep to rules here. No one stirs after the moon." Those words made Elias' jaw tighten. Suspicion was the first plant in his mind. Why keep such a rule if the house prided itself on hospitality? He answered with politeness and with the clarity of a man who had spent nights sleeping in barns, "I don't mean to disturb any rule. I only ask a dry bed and a warm bowl." Thomas' eyes flicked toward the manor. He crossed his arms, the lantern glinting. "Show me your coin. Then I will call the lady." The man placed his hand inside his satchel and produced a few silver coins, dull with travel. Thomas accepted them and, after a silence, pushed the gate back open just enough for Elias to pass. The gravel sucked at Elias' boots as he followed Thomas' long stride up the drive. The manor's windows were black panes stacked like stilled eyes. When Elias glanced back, the lane behind them vanished into the rain. They entered the great hall with no flourish. The door closed with a hollow thud that felt like a verdict. Lady Isabel Grimwood stood waiting beneath an oil portrait, hands folded at her throat. She was poised and small in the wide doorway, her gown cut in muted morning tones, and she regarded Elias with a neat, measured curiosity. "Lady Isabel, Thomas." And Elias noticed how his voice altered when he named her. "A traveler claims shelter." He did not say the man's name again. Lady Isabel inclined her head by a fraction. "Elias Morton, Elias," and added, "My coach broke at Crabby's Hollow. I seek only shelter until morning." Isabel's eyes narrowed for a beat, as if she were measuring the truth. "We can offer a dry room," she said finally. Her voice was soft and controlled. "You will keep to the wing assigned. You will not open shutters after dark. You will not go to the cellars after moonrise." Her list sounded like commands. Elias heard more in the cadence than in the words. The house insisted on certain behaviors, and those behaviors had the power of law within these walls. His mind adjusted, shifting from simple gratitude to a quiet irritation. One emotion shifted into another, suspicion into irritation. He had been refused worse in country inns. He kept his tone light. "I will obey what you ask. I am grateful for shelter." Thomas moved toward a smaller corridor and gestured for Elias to follow. "Mir. Morton will have the north chamber. He will put his things there." Shut the shutters at once. As they passed a low landing, a servant girl glanced at Elias, then hurried away with a cloth in her hands. The corridor smelled of boiled starch and wood polish. Lady Isabel watched from the great hall as they walked, her hands folded at her throat. When they reached the service landing, Thomas pushed open a narrow hatch with the edge of his boot. A thin seam of cold air breathed up from below. Elias bent to look. Fresh footprints marked the damp stone steps leading down into the dark, a single line of boot prints that stopped halfway. He called Thomas' attention without meaning to show alarm, but his voice rose when he spoke. "There are prints. Someone has been in the cellar." Thomas's jaw stiffened. "No one goes below after dark." "You saw the rule." Elias stayed crouched and ran the heel of his hand along the damp tread. The prints were not new in the sense of having mud clinging. They were pressed into the stone, slight but recent enough that the edges had not been scarred by wind. The air rising from the hatch smelled of cold earth and something older, stone warmed by a slow presence. How long since someone was in the cellar? Elias. Thomas looked toward the great hall as if to see whether Lady Isabel had heard. He answered quietly, not since supper, maybe. Thomas' voice broke into a clipped sentence, or later, the exchange shifted the night's mood again. Irritation gave way to unease. Elias straightened, feeling the hair at his neck lift. Then someone was there after the hour. That makes 2 violations. Thomas' hand moved to the battered lantern at his belt. He did not light it. We will speak of it in the morning. For now, the house must be kept quiet. They escorted Elias to a small guest room on the upper wing. The chamber smelled of beeswax and lavender sachets. Lady Isabel stood at the threshold and repeated the instructions with an even hand. You will eat alone. You will not go below. You will not open the shutters until morning. Elias nodded. He placed his satchel on the chair and looked toward the narrow window. The shutters were already closed. He heard the manors clocks tick, small and precise. He bowed his head in thanks and hoped the night would pass uneventfully. Before Lady Isabel left, she said, "If anything disturbs you, speak to Thomas. Do not wander." When the door closed, Elias sat on the edge of the chair and felt the night as events rearranged themselves in his mind. One more emotion shift. Unease folded into resolve. He would not be frightened from answers. He had come to this county to reach an appointment at dawn, and he could not be stalled by vague household customs. He opened his satchel to check his few provisions, his fingers finding the worn pocket watch and the thin scrap of newspaper he had carried for warmth. He set the watch on the table and listened for the tick. Footsteps below cut off the sound. A distant thud reverberated up through the floorboards, then silence. Elias rose and moved to the shutters. He rested his palm on the wood and felt the cold transmitting through it. He thought of the prince and of the way Thomas had said, "or later," and his mouth tightened. He did not open the shutter. Instead, he wrapped his oilskin cloak about his shoulders and went down to the servants' corridor. The house held its breath. On the landing, he found Thomas leaning against the banister, the lantern dark at his side. "You came down," Thomas observed, not surprised. "You should not be here. I found Prince by the hatch." "Did you know someone went below, Elias?" Thomas' reply was a quick declination. "We keep the cellar for the house's stores. Everyone knows they ours. If you saw footprints, you saw them. Mind your own business, Mr. Morton." Elias let his hands rest on the banister. He wanted to press the matter. His voice lowered. "Thomas, I sleep in your house. If the cellar is open after the hour, that matters to me." Thomas' eyes narrowed to slits. He glanced toward the great hall and then back. The groundskeeper folded himself inward, the old loyalty pressing like a weight. "You belong to the rules under this roof for tonight. You will agree or we will put you on the road." Elias felt the staccato of anger and impatience. He answered quickly, "I agree to respect the house rules, but I will not be lied to." "Did anyone go below?" Thomas' mouth opened, then closed. He exhaled in a sound like a rasped breath. "A servant, just one. Ran to fetch something." It was nothing. Elias watched the man's face. Small lines around Thomas' mouth shifted when he lied, his eyes flicking to the latch. The traveler, pressed with a calm that concealed a second shift to suspicion, turned toward accusation. "Which servant?" Thomas gave a name in a clipped sound. "Martha." Elias repeated the name, "Martha." "I will remember." They walked back toward the great hall and found Lady Isabel standing by the mantel, a candle beginning to burn in the brazier. The flame threw a warm circle across her gloves. Elias addressed her directly. "Lady Isabel, Thomas says a servant ran to the cellar after hours. Can you confirm?" She regarded him like a woman assembling evidence. "Thomas, you had seen footprints. He the same that he told you. It was Martha fetching a bottle for the kitchen. Anything else will be handled by the servants." Elias met her gaze. He kept his voice level. "If Martha went below while the moon was up, it suggests someone moved there despite your orders. That matters to the safety of everyone here." Isabel's fingers tightened on the edge of the mantel. "Mr. Morton, you are a guest. You must trust that we know how to manage our house." He heard the insistence of rank in that sentence. It was a reminder that reputations, not fact, often ruled these rooms. For a moment Elias felt the old reluctance to press further. Then a distinct sound interrupted the conversation. A heavy thud from below, closer than before, as if a door had been shut hard. The servants around them started. The firelight licked higher. An external event, the sudden slam, turned the tone into alarm. Elias looked at Thomas. The groundskeeper's body shifted forward, his shoulders square. That came from the cellar, he said. Isabel's face did not show fear, but her hand went to her throat and she pinched the jet brooch there. She stepped forward a pace. Thomas, see to it. Find out what happened. Bring me answers. Thomas' mouth tightened. He made a small curt motion and left the hall with the long, purposeful stride of a man used to work. Isabel turned back to Elias. You will remain in the drawing room until we know what this is. Do not wander the corridors alone. Elias held to the edge of his patience. He obeyed and moved to a chair by the hearth. The house filled with low voices as servants murmured in corners. For a while the only sounds were the clock, the wet downdraft at the windows, and the servants' soft movements. Conversations swelled and contracted. After 20 minutes Thomas returned, his face set in a mask they could not mistake. He moved straight to Isabel and reported in a few clipped words. The cellar door was open. Nothing was taken. No one was there when I went down. There were more prints leading to the hatch and then away beyond the storeroom. Isabel's fingers trembled where they pressed the edge of the mantel. She did not speak at once. When she did, her voice was low and very precise. Someone came into our cellar while the moon was high. No one should be there at that time. Someone has broken our rules. Elias leaned forward. Who would risk this house for a bottle? Who moved through your storeroom and then left? The question sharpened the air. Several servants looked toward Elias as if he had uttered a rude thing. Isabel replied, There are matters in this house I do not discuss with strangers. Her words landed like a lock. Elias saw in a flash her hands close and remembered the mole at her jawline, the way she tilted her head when listening. He imagined how forms of authority like hers kept secrets with tidy gestures and polite speech. Elias felt his temper slope toward frustration. He had expected courtesy and found guardedness. He swallowed that irritation and tried a clearer tactic. Lady Isabel, I am no thief. I only ask because the footprints show someone moved after hours. That could be a danger to us all. He named the danger with practical terms. Unauthorized movement, potential theft, unknown presence. Isabel turned her eyes fully on him. We have less to fear than you think, Mr. Morton. The household manages itself. If anyone breaches the rules, we will attend to them. Now you will go to your room and sleep. Elias bowed a little. He kept his voice steady very well. But if anything happens, Thomas will tell me. She inclined her head, and around them the servants resumed their hushed rhythms. Elias rose and walked the corridor toward his chamber. He saw, as he passed the foot of the main stair, the servants closing shutters with practiced hands. Each motion felt like a page being closed. At the threshold of his room, Elias paused. He found a small scrap of paper tucked beneath the edge of his bed, an old theatre ticket folded thin, with a printed name and a date. He had not seen it when he entered. He picked it up. The ticket was stamped for a performance in a town 3 counties away. Someone had slipped it there. His fingers tightened around the ragged edge. The ticket suggested clandestine movement. A person who had been outside the planned movements of the household, a meeting perhaps, or a message. Elias' mind narrowed. He folded the ticket into his pocket and did not light his lamp. Outside, a wind rode the eaves and the moon at last cleared the clouds in a pale slice. At the same moment, distant but distinct, came a soft metallic clack from the cellar below, like a latch moving into place. Elias froze and then moved to the door. He pressed his ear to it. The sound did not repeat. He straightened and took the folded ticket, feeling its edges under his thumb. The night sequence had hardened into a shape. Footprints, an open hatch, a cellar stir, a slipped paper. Each piece nudged suspicion into determination. He sat on the bedside and set the ticket on his knee, his hands quiet. He resolved to watch, to listen, to find what had been hidden. A light knock sounded at his door. He called, Come, Thomas' head appeared, the hallway behind him dark. He peered in and did not smile. You awake, Morton, I am awake. He stepped in and closed the door behind him. You do not open shutters, sir. You do not go down. You sleep. Elias met his gaze. Thomas, someone moved in your cellar tonight. I found a ticket under my bed. Thomas' shoulders tightened, then slumped with a resigned sigh. We will search in the morning. For tonight, sleep. Elias put the ticket back into his pocket and slid his fingers across the chain of his pocket watch. The metal was cool, familiar. He watched Thomas leave and then sat still until the house quieted. He thought through the night's facts once more and arranged them, as if laying out tools on a table. He considered which of them would move first at dawn. He did not unburden himself to sleep. He listened for footsteps, for the creak of boots, for a whisper carried by the stair. Around 1 in the morning a soft patter at the landing made him lift himself, and, obeying curiosity, he went to the shutters and pressed his eye to the tiny slit between boards. He could see only a narrow patch of moonlit sky and the glint of glass in the servant's wing. He did not open the shutter. He returned to the bed and, with the ticket burning in his pocket like a small accusation, he finally let his breath slow. A new sound startled him awake. A muffled voice in the corridor, low and urgent. He rose and crept to the door. The voice was Thomas S., clipped in close. Lady Isabel, you should not be here. Isabel's voice answered with the same measured control. Thomas, not a word here. We will act carefully. Elias pressed his ear to the keyhole and heard footsteps move away. He felt the night's tension settle like a stone in his belly and a spike of resolve. He had shelter, he had a scrap of evidence, and he had 2 people whose choices could alter the night. He put his hand to the pocket that held the ticket and left the room. He did not go into the dark. He only stood for a long moment in the corridor as the manor rearranged itself against the moon. He had pressed the house for answers and met only controlled omission. He had seen prints, an open hatch and a closed cellar door. He had found a ticket under his bed. The night had yielded a small, precise set of facts. The next choice mattered. Confront now, or wait until dawn. He stepped back to his door, closed it, and sat on the bed with his hands folded. The ticket lay on his knee like a question that would not be left unanswered. Outside, somewhere under the manor, something had moved, and the house had not spoken its name. The chapter ends with the metallic sound of the cellar latch closing again below, a definite click that makes Elias rise and press his ear to the floorboards, listening for the next movement. The folded scrap of paper struck Thomas Harker's palm before Elias could step forward to stop it. Suspicion, sharp and immediate, tightened Elias' mouth. He narrowed his eyes and held his lantern higher to catch the maid's face. The maid's cheeks were pale, her apron damp with dishwater, and she looked away toward the long window where the moon had already climbed past the roof line. Thomas, Elias. Voice level but quick, what is that? He kept the name like an anchor. Thomas' head turned with the slow motion of a man who keeps his distance by habit. Elias had no right to intervene, but the scrap, the furtive look toward the moon, and the way Thomas closed his fingers over the paper made the night's stakes immediate and visible. Elias remembered the gate, how the iron had banged back against its hinge when he had forced his way in. Rain striking his collar and his lantern flaring once before the wick went thin. That memory sat like a measured step behind him. It told him he was out of place and yet already entangled. He kept the lantern lifted. He watched Thomas fold the scrap and tuck it beneath his thumb with thumbs that still smelled faintly of oil and garden earth. Elias' suspicion propelled him forward. He stepped into the servants' passage where the ceiling sloped low and the floorboards creaked in a pattern he could read like a pulse. You shouldn't be here, Thomas. Blunt and short as a shovel's handle, but not moving to block Elias. Elias could see the brass ring at Thomas's belt, the worn leather gloves bulging in the pocket, and the way his eyes flicked to the high window as if checking the moon's position. The maid had already slipped away, hands clasped to her chest, hair damp against her temple. Elias could feel the shift in the house through the servants' silence. Dishes paused on trays, footsteps muffled, and the temperature in the passage seemed to tilt toward something held back. He heard Thomas' breath steady and low, and the lantern light painted a hard line across Thomas' knuckles. Who is she? Elias. He spoke the question to Thomas, and in doing so tied his curiosity to the groundskeeper's secret posture. She called you by name. She looked frightened. Elias kept his sentences short, watching Thomas' face for a crack. She is a child of the house. Thomas. He shifted his weight. Mind your steps, sir. You are a guest here. The words were not a polite deflection. They were a measured warning. Elias's suspicion moved into something colder, calculation. He took a step back to the low archway and let the lantern trace the passage behind him. The house's sound lines folded. A kettle's high note, the scrape of a chair upstairs, a distant footfall in the gravel where Elias had fought the gate not an hour before. They crossed the passage into the great hall together, because the house moved them that way. The servant who had served wine offered Elias a thin smile and pushed his plate a little farther from the window. Lady Isabel Grimwood sat at the head of the table like a still study, hands folded on the tablecloth, the jet brooch at her throat a black punctuation. She raised her chin once when Elias entered, and in that quick motion Elias read the careful poise he had seen in the garden's portraits. Precise, rehearsed. Conversation remained narrow as a trimmed hedge. Questions about the road were answered with short civility and no follow-up. Lady Isabel kept her gaze level, but once her eyes flicked to the windows and then away. The servants mirrored the motion with a uniform quickness that made Elias's unease solid. Elias Moreton, the head butler said as he poured wine. Pronouncing Elias's name twice, as if testing its weight, "You must tell us of your journey in the morning." The line fell into the room and the place shifted back towards ceremony. Elias offered small, measured phrases about the rain and the broken wagon wheel he had seen on the lane. He kept his voice even. His suspicion did not vanish. It merely wrapped itself in courtesy. Under the table a hand slid, careful and certain, something small and metallic across to Thomas. Elias felt his attention pull down like a cord. The brass key was no larger than his thumb and warm from pocket skin. Thomas folded his fingers around it so his knuckles blanched. The servant who had passed the key kept his face expressionless, but his eyes lingered briefly on Elias before lowering to the carved leg of the table. Elias shared a look with Thomas and felt a shift in his emotions, curiosity sharpening into a guarded demand. He forced himself to keep his voice ordinary. "Thomas," Elias murmured once the plates cleared, "what is that key for?" He used the man's name again, slow and clear. Thomas' jaw worked. He tapped the key with a forefinger, then slid it back into his palm. "Somewhere the master keeps out of strangers' way, Thomas, for the house's sake." The phrase pinched at Elias. It sounded both protective and evasive. He kept his fork poised, felt the metal press into his palm, steadying him. The household's eyes flicked away from the table windows as if some sound in the night had been counted and judged. After supper Elias excused himself. He moved through the dim corridors with the lantern in one hand, fingers warming the brass. The corridor smelled of beeswax and old polish, and on the banister at the top of a narrow staircase he noted a smear of damp earth, as if someone had climbed with soil still on their hands. Elias traced that smear with a thumb, and his chest tightened into a question he could not yet name aloud. He opened the half door at the end of the landing and peered down the narrow stair. A staircase that had not shown itself to a guest when he arrived with the rain and the slammed gate. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Lady Isabel already there, the lamplight sharpening the small mole at her jaw. She did not appear surprised to find him on the corridor. Instead, she regarded him with a composure that held something like cold alarm at the edges. "Elias," she said, voice even but low, "the stair you see is not for guests. Please return to your chamber." She kept her posture precise. The lace of her glove touched the banister as if to measure the wood's warmth. "Lady Isabel, Elias, the banister is smudged. Someone used that stair recently." He let the statement stand without accusation, hoping measurement would pull the matriarch's truth into the open. Her fingers tightened once on the banister. For a breath, her face slipped, an alarm that did not break her voice but shortened the beat between her words. Some things are kept to the house's needs. She said, there are measures we take after the moon rises. You would do well to rest and not meddle in them. Elias watched her eyes for the slightest tremor. Instead he found a quick, guarded softness that vanished so fast he wondered if he had imagined it. Suspicion shifted under Elias's ribs into a quieter urgency. Protectiveness, not in the abstract, but aimed at a concrete fear that someone in the house might be at risk. You warned me earlier, Elias, stepping closer. You mean to leave certain doors alone. I did not come here to pry Lady Isabel, but a smudge on a banister is an open thing. It asks for an answer. His voice did not rise, it tightened. He read the motion in her hands and chose to press. She had been polite with him at supper. Now her composure sank into a protective insistence. She held his gaze an extra beat. We keep to the house. She repeated, it keeps to itself. Then she turned and walked away, her steps measured, her gloves rustling once. Elias stood at the corridor and felt the house turn away from him. He heard Thomas' boots on the stair below, steady and slow as a man who counts his steps by habit. Elias could not sleep. The scrap pressed at him like a loose thread. He found Thomas by the rear door, where the garden lantern hung low and guttered with the damp. Thomas' shoulders were squared away from him, but the lantern light caught the salt and pepper in his hair. Elias's suspicion now took shape as a decision. He would demand an answer of the house. Thomas, Elias without preamble, that scrap you took from the maid. Why was she looking at the moon? He kept his sentences short and direct, so that anything Thomas would have to be concrete. Thomas' eyes narrowed. He went silent long enough for the stable tack in the yard to creak in the wind. Because certain things are done when the moon is high, Thomas. Because the house remembers an old account. Because sometimes he cut himself off and looked away. Elias watched the man's hands. Because we keep what must not be seen. Mir. Morton, the words landed with the weight of a tool set down. Is this about safety, Elias? He did not yet name the fear in him. Instead he listed a practical question. Are the servants protecting someone? The question forced Thomas to raise his eyes. Thomas' mouth softened once. He glanced at the manor as if measuring its eaves and shutters. We protect the house, children, he said. Come with me, then. Keep your head low and mind your breath. He moved like a man who expected to be followed but did not invite it. They went to the landing together. Elias kept his steps quiet, his lantern low, and his fingers at his satchel strap. The half-open door yawed a little farther when Thomas pushed it, a hinge that complained under the weight of years. The stairs smelled of cool earth and the faint tang of iron. At the bottom, a low chamber opened up, where oil lamps had been set in a deliberate circle. The lamps were small and bright against bare flagstone. A child's shoe lay in a shallow ring of scraped marks around a drain. The leather cracked and small enough that Elias recognized at once the shape of something once worn by a child's foot. Elias's stomach dropped into a new tone of alarm. The room's arrangement read as ritual. Lanterns placed at equal intervals, chalk lines cut into the stone, and a ring of small handprints rubbed dark with soil. The light from the grate above let the moon's beam fall in a pale wedge across the floor and catch on the shoe as if spotlighting it. Servants stood motionless in the corners like statues in their work clothes, the same men and women who had served at supper only an hour before. Their faces were neutral, but their hands twitched at their sides. In one, Elias noticed a trembling that the lamplight would not conceal. Mayor Morton, Thomas close behind him. You should not have come. The sentence contained both apology and warning. Elias' anger and curiosity came together into a single force. He moved into the chamber even as a servant closed the stair above with a quiet thud. Elias walked the circle and kept his eyes on the shoe. He crouched and reached out 2 fingers to touch it. The leather was damp to the touch, as if the shoe had been left outside in fog. He felt some practical resolve edge into his motion. Identify, understand, and then decide. One of the servants, John, the footman who had poured Elias wine, stepped forward, and his voice was small. We do this for keeping. John, we do this because the house asks for it at the moon. It makes the things soft for a night. John looked at Thomas as if for agreement. Thomas' shoulders tightened and then loosened. We do it for the child's sleep, Thomas added. Elias stared at the two men. What child? He demanded. He could hear himself pushing past the courtesy the house expected and reaching for a human answer. The room shifted. Someone knocked a lantern stand and the light shook. A silence stretched where every breath seemed heavy. Not a child of yours, sir. John, not your child, he swallowed, but a child of the family once. The house keeps its debts in odd ways. Elias felt the first real twist of the chapter there. What he had assumed were protective rituals for the household became a payment of sorts, obscure and precise, handed down to men who measured moonrise like a clock. His suspicion changed shape into a new question. Who in the Grimwood line demanded such a ledger of the servants? Who for this? Elias pressed. John looked away. Lady Isobel's mother asked it once, they say, for a wrong done long ago. We keep it 'cause we were told to keep it. We were told to watch when the moon is high. The revelation reframed earlier signs, the maid's furtive glance, the key hidden under the table, the matriarch's peculiar alarm on the landing. Elias felt a flash of clarity. He had thought the house secretive to protect itself. It now appeared the house carried a private account, an exchange of small, ritual acts for a silence kept. A sound cut the room. A footstep on the flagstone above, light and careful. Everyone's eyes snapped upward. Elias' heart sped. The footstep was followed by another, and then the soft click of Lady Isobel's fan as she cleared her throat somewhere upstairs. The servants exchanged looks that were not quite obedience and not quite fear. Elias read the motion as a test. Something about presence above would alter what happened below. Before anyone could speak, Thomas moved. He strode to the circle's edge and set his battered lantern down so the light washed the shoe in a warmer glow. Then he reached into his pocket and brought out the small brass key that Elias had seen at supper, the one warmed from a palm under the table. He set it on the stone and pushed it gently toward the shoe. The motion made Elias' jaw clamp. We keep the key to the lock under the west terrace. Thomas, we have kept it for years. When the moon is high, we take what the house asks and make it right in the cellar. His voice was flat, edged with a tenderness Elias would not have expected from a man who kept keys and mended fences. The key's presence reframed everything, the hidden exchange beneath the table, the maid's fear. The twist hit Elias with simple, cold logic. Someone in the house was offering sacrifice, or recompense, according to a rule he had not yet learned. A door above creaked and steps came down the stair. Lady Isobel appeared at the top of the stair in the doorway, her gown catching the lamplight. Her gloves were folded at her wrist, and she looked at the circle with a narrowness that suggested both ownership and withdrawal. Ms. R. Morton, she said, crossing one arm over the other, this is a family matter. You must leave it to us. Her voice lacked softness. It carried a small authority that made the servants' shoulders dip in deference. Elias did not step back. Lady Isobel, I have watched a scrap be passed in the passage, a key passed under a table, and a stare kept from guests. I was told to leave it alone. I have seen a child's shoe laid in a ring. I cannot pretend I do not believe what I see. His sentences came quick, but each held to detail. He used the household's names and items because concrete facts compelled action more than accusations. She studied him an extra beat, as if weighing how much he must be told. Then she moved down the stair into the lamplight and stopped at the edge of the circle. You are kind, Elias Morton, but kindness can be dangerous here if misapplied, she said. Her voice steadied, and for the first time she let the barest flicker of something like regret cross her face. So slight Elias might have missed it if he were not watching for cracks. Thomas' expression shifted. He looked toward Lady Isobel with a softness that made Elias remember the quick tenderness Thomas had shown to the maid the night Elias first arrived. That tenderness now reframed as loyalty. Thomas would bear burdens rather than speak in ways that might undo an entire household. Elias felt a new change of feeling, doubt about his right to pry. Then resolved to keep pushing because a child had been mentioned, and the shoe on stone did not belong to an abstraction. Then tell me this, Elias, stepping forward. Who keeps watch when the moon is up? What do you ask of your people that leaves a child's shoe in the cellar? He kept his words plain and his posture open, because he wanted information, not spectacle. Lady Isobel inhaled. "It is not what you imagine," she said, and then she paused. "Once a wrong was done to a little one of the house. My mother swore that the house must never be asked to forget that wrong without something given in return. The house takes reminders. The servants keep the reminders and present them at night so the house will hold its peace." Her voice did not soften into romance. It carried the hard practicality of a ledger kept and balanced. Elias heard no sentimentality, only a small, private accounting. He nodded, feeling the final twist sharpen. The ritual was not about superstition but history handled as debt. Why did the maid give the scrap to Thomas, Elias? Lady Isobel's gaze slid away for a breath, she to be relieved of watching. Lady Isobel, she is young and frightened by the task. She for a hand, the answer reframed the maid's furtive motion. Not a conspiracy but a plea for help passed in the hall. Elias felt momentary shame for how quick he had been to suspect conspiracy. His doubt shifted into concern, and concern into a practical plan forming in his head. "Then tell me the rules, Elias. Tell me what you expect of Thomas, John, and those who stand here, and I will not interfere except to make sure no one is harmed." The sentence was an offer and a demand. He wanted specifics, locks, places, times, things he could guard or expose. The servants' faces softened with a relief like a rope slackening. Lady Isobel looked at Thomas. He hesitated, then nodded once. He spoke with the clipped measure of a man who counts and keeps his secrets to himself. "We keep a watch on the terrace at the west end. We place the reminders at midnight and remove them by dawn. The key opens the hatch above the cellar drain. We keep the hatch closed while the house sleeps, and open it only when the moon counts off its hours." He kept his gaze on the shoe, and did not add anything to cushion the account. Elias listened and calculated. Outside, a branch scraped the window. Someone above moved a chair. The house resumed the low noises of lived rooms. Elias' mind assembled the facts into a plan. He would not allow the ritual to continue undisclosed. He would watch the west terrace and the hatch. He would keep an eye on the servants and the matriarch. His emotions shifted again. From suspicion to alarm to a focused determination that felt like a physical tool in his hands. Thomas reached down and picked up the brass key. He turned it over in his palm and slid it into his pocket, as if it were a living thing. "You should sleep now, Mir. Morton, Thomas, the house asks for no more tonight." The sentence was a closing gesture, but carried an implied request that Elias accept the house's order and withdraw. Elias stood at the lip of the cellar and looked at Lady Isobel. He saw the jet brooch at her throat, the way her hands kept the fan folded like a shield. "If the house keeps a wrong," he said, "then someone should know why it keeps it. Name me an hour and a place to be told the facts. Tell me something I can hold." His speech pushed for a tangible next step. Lady Isobel hesitated, then said, "Midnight in the small sitting room. Only facts. No interference." Her voice carried the authority of someone who sets terms. Elias nodded. The agreement felt brittle and practical. He had forced an explanation, and he had made a place to meet it. They left the cellar then, and the servants filed away with the deliberate slowness of men who had been excused from a duty. Elias went back up the staircase and found his chamber with hands that trembled just enough for him to notice. He set his lantern on the stand and lay on the bed without closing his eyes, listening for the house's small noises and tracing the list he had made in his head. The maid's scrap, the brass key, the child's shoe, Lady Isobel's submission of a past wrong, and Thomas' steady, protective measures. Outside, through the high window, the moon climbed toward the terrace and over the west eaves where the hatch waited. The house settled into its ordered breathing. Elias let his resolve harden into a decision. At midnight he would be in the sitting room to hear facts. He would stay until he had either been shown the ledger of wrongs or forced to accept that some households keep painful accounts. He lay there and felt his hands curl into steady fists, the most physical proof he could make of his intent. Down the corridor, a servant's footfall paused and then went on. At the sitting room door, Lady Isabel straightened her gloves once and turned away, the lock's metal catching in the lamplight. The door closed with a click that settled like a question on the landing. Elias listened to that click as if it were a bell calling him to wakefulness. He would meet the matriarch at midnight and ask for a ledger that had taken the house a generation to compile. He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but to hold the plan in a single steady place. Outside, the wind moved along the eaves, and the roof caught the moon, and the house kept its account until the hour to speak came. Elias kept his lantern within reach. He breathed, fingers still clenched, and waited for midnight to bring answers he could either accept or expose. The chapter ended with Lady Isabel's hand closing the sitting room door behind her. The lock clicked once, and footsteps passed beyond it. Elias heard the steps and the click, and the landing held the next question as precisely as a placed coin. Elias unfolded the scrap at the dining table and read the single line aloud. "Do not go down at moonrise." Suspicion tightened his mouth the way a jaw clamps when a man tastes metal. He kept the paper between two fingers and let his eyes travel the room to test reactions. The servants had frozen mid-movement. One maid's hand hovered at her apron. Another, the footman, held his tray with fingers white at the knuckles. Elias's suspicion drove him to speak first. "Who left this?" he asked, and his voice filled the great hall as plainly as a struck bell. He had come through the gate drenched and breathless earlier that evening, the iron latch slamming behind him, and the lantern flaring once before it went dim. That image of the gate striking home sat in his memory like a bruise. Now knives and plates lay arranged on the long table. Candles burned in glass sconces. Lady Isabel Grimwood sat already in a high chair at the head, a cup poised in her gloved hand, her face composed. Thomas Harker stood near the sideboard with his arms folded. The maid who had pressed the scrap into someone's palm vanished into the shadow of an arched doorway and did not return. Elias set the scrap down where the candle could catch the ink. His fingers left a dark smudge on the paper. He pushed his chair back an inch and the scrape against stone sounded loudly. This was not idle curiosity. It was a tangible problem. The scrap said, "Do not go down." It suggested danger tied to the cellar and to the moon. Elias' actions followed his suspicion. He did not let the sentence hang in the air. "Who warned me?" he repeated. Lady Isabel's hand tightened around her cup. She lifted her chin slightly. "Careful and measured, Mr. Morton," she said. "We have had odd ways here for years. You must understand household prudence." Her voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of the room. She did not call the maid back. She did not move to take the scrap from Elias' hand. Thomas Harker glanced at Elias with a face that showed less patience than heat. "You best leave whatever you found alone, Thomas." He stepped forward, boots thudding on flagstone. "This house keeps its own rules." His words struck like a blunt warning, meant to close a door. Elias watched Thomas rather than the maid. He watched the man whose shoulders carried years of labor, whose hands were always near keys and latches. Elias had seen Thomas at the gate when he first arrived. The groundskeeper's eyes had measured him then and measured him still. Elias's suspicion shifted to doubt. Why would a household protect a danger? Why issue veiled instructions? He set his cup down and looked at Lady Isabel again. "Lady Isabel, Elias," name carefully placed on the syllables. "Someone has warned me not to go below when the moon is up. There is a cellar hatch in the back. What is kept there that must not be seen?" He spoke plainly, no flourish. He expected a concrete answer. Lady Isabel gave him a small, rehearsed smile. "This estate has old customs, Mr. Morton. Old ladies will not be asked for explanations in a dining hall. If you must know, speak with Thomas or with the servants after supper." Her hands moved, the lace at her wrist flickering. The smile promised civility and withheld fact. The footman, a thin youth named Carter, shifted his weight and set down a covered dish. He would later be the one to lead Elias up the narrow back stair. For now he kept his eyes on the plate. Short lines of talk passed among the servants like quiet signals. Thomas cleared his throat and said, "Sit. Eat what is given. We are being watched in strange ways tonight, but a full stomach steadies a man." His voice did not match the look in his eyes. Conversation resumed as a practiced thing. Forks clinked. Elias ate, though he kept glancing at the back door, where the landing stair lay hidden. He felt a change in the room when a strip of moonlight crossed the flagstone and fell toward the hearth, a narrow silver band. The servant stiffened again. Carter's hand trembled slightly as he poured wine. The maid who had passed the scrap earlier slipped between chairs and moved toward the service door. She was small and quick. Elias noticed the dampness at her sleeves where water had splashed from washing. He rose and made to follow her. 2 chairs scraped behind him. Thomas' broad frame blocked the passage without turning. "You will find nothing that is for your concern." Thomas, plain and blunt. Elias did not retort. He moved anyway. He walked the service passage by the hearth where oil lamps hung on brackets and left scent on the air. Tallow and old grace, the faint tang of boiled meat. The maid had disappeared. On the landing, Elias found the narrow back stair. The wood underfoot was worn where feet had pressed it for decades. He paused and then climbed. At the top of the service stair, a half-open door gave onto a landing where the moon had pushed its way through a high window. Damp prints marred the stone by the cleft of the stair. Elias crouched and brought a finger to the smear. The moisture left a dark trace on his glove. He followed the prints with his eyes. They led toward a trapdoor with iron bands. A thin line of moonlight lay across the handle. He was not alone. A maid stood in the shadow of a doorway, hands clasped at her apron. She looked at Elias without speaking. Her eyes flicked to the hatch and back to him. She did not meet his gaze. Her hands made a timid gesture toward the hatch and then folded back against her skirt. That gesture said beware in a way her mouth would not. Thomas' voice came down the stair like a stone dropping. "You hear, Elias?" he asked. He stood now on the landing, lantern in hand, and his face was not entirely rough in its expression. The lantern threw a yellow pool on the single step. "You shouldn't be poking about, Thomas." The clipped cadence of his speech held impatience and something like zeal. Elias kept his stance steady. He named the thing plainly. "There are prints. Someone comes and goes at night." The scrap said, "Do not go down at moonrise." "I need to know why." He could see the beat of Thomas's jaw, the way the groundskeeper watched exits. Thomas' mouth tightened. He took a breath and moved his lantern closer until the light outlined Elias's face. "You heard the lady. It's not for guests, Thomas." He added another sentence, softer. "We keep a child safe below." The words came as if through a trap, abrupt and near to breaking. Elias' thoughts shifted again, suspicion sliding toward pity. His fingers flexed at the strap of his satchel. "A child?" he asked. The single word was sharp and immediate. He looked for denial on Thomas's face. Instead he found an expression that held years of carrying a quiet burden. Thomas flinched as if some memory pinched him. "Not what you think. Not some ghastly thing. She is small, and she cannot be seen by certain folk at certain times. We keep her below at moonrise because of what they say by the village. We protect her." The words came in clipped sentences, each one like a shovel strike. Elias had to test it. Who makes such claims in the village? He asked. "Rumors, Thomas, old talk. Folks who want mind what they say about strangers. The less they see, the less they talk. You must understand, Mr. Morton, how a rumor can take hold. It will call names and make a thing monstrous where there is only need." He looked away then, toward the hatch, as if it might speak its own defense. Elias wanted clearer facts. He wanted ledger entries, receipts, any proof that the household's efforts were for care and not for ritual. The ladder he had seen earlier in the storeroom came to mind. He swallowed and lowered his voice. "Show me the ledger, Thomas. Let me see names and dates. If you shelter someone, document it." He put the request plainly. Thomas' gaze sharpened. "You ask too much of an hour, Elias. You press where pressing is. Wait until morning. Lady Isobel will make account of her reasons then." He stepped toward the hatch and set the lantern on the edge of the landing. The metal handle caught the light and glinted. Elias looked at the lantern, at the iron hatch, and then over Thomas' shoulder into the dark seam between boards. The air that came up smelled of wet straw and old apples. It smelled like cellars he had known in inns and villages. He could almost hear the whisper of rats in the joists. Thomas reached for the handle, paused, and did something Elias did not expect. He lifted the lantern so that its light hit the stone beside the hatch, and then, with a reluctant motion, he withdrew his hand. Carter passed close by then and muttered something about hot dishes. The maid who had warned Elias earlier pressed a dish into a tray and avoided eye contact as she moved. The household continued its motions, but with a visible strain, as if everyone had rehearsed a walk with a hidden limp. Elias took advantage of the bustle. When Thomas turned to lift the lantern again to head down the stair, Elias slipped past him with the furtive step of someone who will not be stopped by a blunt statement. Below, the cellar opened into a low passage with shelves of jars and boxes stacked against damp walls. Elias's boots found the uneven stones. He moved by touch and memory, letting the dim light fall where he needed it. A small door stood half shut. When Elias pushed it, it gave on hinges that squealed once and then stopped. Inside, behind crates of potatoes and barrels of turnips, a ledger lay tucked beneath a broken crate. He did not pause for wonder. He pulled the ledger free and bent to the page. Names and numbers scrawled in a cramped, careful hand stared back. Dates marched along the margin. A single name repeated over and over on the same page, Molly Grimwood. Elias traced the ink with a fingertip. The ledger listed supplies, candles, milk, blankets, each entry marked against dates that aligned with moon cycles. That fact shifted his judgment a notch. The household had spent for the child, not taken. A crate rustled behind him and he whirled. Thomas stood in the doorway with his hands empty and his face folded into that rough expression Elias had learned to read. "You prying in ledgers you have no business in." Thomas, voice low. There was a short, hard exchange coming. They exchanged 3 quick lines in the doorway, the kind of quick parry that decides whether hands go to weapons. "Thomas, explain this ledger." Elias. "Lady Isabel for such records to be kept," Thomas replied. "Why hidden? Why tuck behind stores?" Elias demanded. Thomas' jaw worked. "Because the town will pry. Because they call what they do not know monstrous." He stepped aside and let the lantern pool light on the ledger. "We feed her. We cloth her. We keep her." Elias read another line, and a faded portrait slipped from between pages as if pushed free by the motion. The small painted face was of a child with hair the color of damp straw and eyes the same pale blue as Lady Isabel's. The portrait had been handled. Its back bore smudges of soot. Elias held it with 2 fingers and felt the trimmer in his hand. He turned at the sound of footsteps above. Quiet shoes padded on the stair. Lady Isabel's voice came down the hatch, small and urgent. "Elias, what are you doing?" she called. Elias looked up and called back, finding what I was told not to find. "What is Molly to you?" His short sentence landed in the cool air. Lady Isabel descended the stairs with such care that the lantern light skimmed her gloves. She carried a small, wrapped bundle in her arms. The bundle moved slightly when she set it down on a box at the cellar's sedge. It was neither heavy nor empty. She placed it as if it were a thing that must not be set down carelessly, and then faced Elias with a look that matched reserve with pleading. "Molly is my great-niece, Lady Isabel." Her voice held a tautness that betrayed the practiced civility. "She has been ill and frightened. The village takes kindly to spectacle and not to sickness. We shelter her when the moon is high because there are tales that twist the truth. We hide her because exposure would make her life harder, not because we mean her harm." Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the lace at her throat. Elias took a step toward her. "Then why the secrecy like a lock and a warning? Why does a maid slip scraps and the household act as if it is saving itself from shame rather than offering care?" He spoke too quickly. His voice rose. The anger in him switched from suspicion to frustration. "Lady Isabel's lips pressed thin. Shame shapes how folks act. You see it in the market and you fear it. I will not parade a child's weakness where tongues will take any weakness and make a story of it." She looked at Thomas. "Do you mean to endanger our protection with this airing?" she asked. Thomas' reply was a string of short sentences. "We keep the night so they will not come. We watch the gate. We keep her fed. We do not let their talk find her. Let it be Lady Isabel. Let the man see what he must but not tear down what keeps her safe." He met Elias' eyes. Then, you can fold this away and sleep. Or else you can watch and let us do what must be done. The choice is yours, stranger. But remember, words travel to the village like seeds on the wind. The exchange had quick, clipped lines, the rapid back and forth of people with stakes. Elias held the portrait a moment longer. The child's eyes looked painted but earnest. He felt the shift from anger into pity again, different now. Pity coupled with responsibility. If this is shelter, show me exactly what you do at moonrise, he said. Show me that you help and not harm. If you will not, then I will tell the magistrate. His threat was quiet but clear. He placed the portrait back between pages and closed the ledger carefully. Lady Isabel's hand went to the jet brooch at her throat. For a second her aristocratic composure cracked. The magistrate will only make a spectacle of a child we could keep safe here, she said. Her voice had the edge of someone cornered. You can present yourself as an enforcer, Mikkel Morton, or you can be a witness to our care. She met his eyes and for the first time made no attempt to smooth the rim of the conversation. There was time for another external event, another change. A sound rose from above. A knock at the main door, measured and 3 short raps. All heads turned. Thomas' hand went to a lantern. Lady Isabel startled like a bird. Footsteps came on the stair above. The knock had the exact cadence of the village constable, a man who liked to keep the right rhythm when he had to inform a household of gossip or law. Elias froze. The sudden arrival changed the stakes. The magistrate's messenger could mean inquiry. It could mean a search. The 3 knocks were a small, concrete event that pushed decisions forward. Thomas stepped to the hatch and peered up. It is only a man asking for lodging, perhaps, he said, but his voice sounded strained, or worse. They bring rumor as proof. He slid a hand along the hatch boards as if to measure their thickness. Lady Isabel moved without hesitation. She lifted the wrapped bundle and covered the ledger with a shawl, then set the shawl down to leave the ledger plainly visible at the edge in the dim light. Her action was precise and deliberate. She arranged what could be seen to tell the right story. Open for him, Thomas, she ordered. Thomas obeyed and climbed. He left Elias and the cellar to the low murmur of their own breath. Elias felt the shift inside him, pity sharpening into resolve. He would not hand the household's secret over to a curiosity, hungry pair of officials without knowing whether their motives were cruelty or concern. He moved to the low passage and crouched where crates cast angles of shadow. He listened. From above came voices. A man's voice with the flatness of an official and another with a higher, eager tone. The exchange above contained names and mundane questions about supper and a bed. The conversation drifted into the hall and into the open courtyard. After a time, footsteps faded away. The knock had been only that, a request for lodging at a late hour. When Thomas returned to the hatch, he did not look at Elias with the same closed-off face. He met him with a roughness that had a thread of gratitude. You heard how easily things might be noticed. Thomas, we cannot risk more than we have to. He paused and rubbed his thumb along the ledger's spine. If you truly want to help, stay in the house and keep what you saw tonight to yourself until Lady Isabel and I decide the best way forward. We need a man who can listen without making an example of us. He looked for a half-second like a man asking for mercy. Elias' decision felt balanced on simple, concrete facts. The ledger, the portrait, the maid's warning, the scrap of paper. He had started the night wanting a place to sleep. He had found instead the household's secret, one that revealed a child's face and a ledger of care. He could take the ledger and march to the magistrate. He could also do what Thomas and observe, giving them time to explain to a less hysterical ear. His choice would shape what the next chapters brought. He spoke without flourish. I will not betray a child to talk, Elias. I will stay and watch, but I will not be lied to. If you harm her, Thomas, I will leave and make sure the right men ask the right questions. The sentence was a pledge and a warning tied together. He met Thomas' eyes and Lady Isabel's as if to set his terms. Thomas exhaled and lowered his shoulders as if a weight had moved. That's more than most would give, he said. We do what we can. Lady Isabel folded her hands and nodded once. The lantern light picked out the fine line at her jaw where the mole stood. She moved to the crate and picked up the bundle that had lain there since her descent. Elias had one last concrete step before he would leave the cellar and take up the watch above. He tucked the ledger under his coat. He felt the leather of his satchel at his side and the small bulk of his pocket watch. These were ordinary things. He took the portrait and placed it on the top shelf where it might be safe from damp and from prying hands, but available enough for a returning guardian. He then climbed the stair and closed the hatch softly behind him. On the landing above, Lady Isobel moved toward the service door with a slow, careful gait. Thomas remained at the hatch and folded his heavy gloves. Elias lingered in a narrow corridor that ran above the cellar and looked down into the arch where a lantern's glow still burned. He positioned himself where a curtain sagged and set his back against cold plaster. He would be alone but not impotent. Outside, the moon traveled across the sky and laid a thin line along the Manorest terrace. Inside, the household resumed its motions, measured and small. Elias kept watch with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the service hatch. He had chosen secrecy for the night in place of immediate exposure. The moment was not a resolution of the larger argument. It was a tactical decision. Near dawn, a softer sound reached him. The shuffling of feet, the low exchange of names, the faint clink of keys. Lady Isobel's voice drifted faintly up the stair. "We will see to her in the morning," she said. Thomas answered with a curt, clipped line. The mattress of sound was domestic and deliberate. Elias sat and let the facts pile. The ledger, the portrait, the maid's damp sleeves, the scrap of paper swarming. Each fact pulled him one way or the other. He made one small physical choice to close the chapter. He drew his brimmed hat down over his brow and settled into a shadowed alcove. He would watch the household move and the moon set. He would test whether Thomas's tenderness was protection or concealment. He would wait until day to press for answers he could not in good conscience force in a cellar at midnight. The hatch below opened once more and then closed with a soft, ordinary sound. Elias rested his hand on the stone beside him and breathed out slowly, his jaw loose for the first time since he had read the scrap. The watch had begun, and with it the next set of consequences. The ledger lay safe beneath a cover of crate and shawl. The portrait's painted face faced the dark. The maid who had slipped the scrap had returned to her duties and avoided looking at Elias directly. Thomas crossed the landing and cast one long look at the door before he mounted the stair to the kitchens. Lady Isobel moved with deliberate care toward her rooms, the small bundle held close. Elias kept his place against the plaster and listened for the ordinary sounds of a household asleep. The soft tick of a clock, a distant cough, the shift of a blanket. He counted them as proof that the night held more than rumor. When he finally nodded off in a cramped chair near the corridor, it was with the knowledge that his choice had kept a secret for the night. He had chosen to bear the weight of that knowledge for the morning's clarity. The last sound he heard before sleep closed his eyes was the cellar hatch clicking once, an ordinary, precise sound that marked the end of the chapter's immediate danger and the start of the next question to be answered. Elias reached the servants' landing and saw Thomas lowering a small locked trunk into the cellar hatch. A brass key clattered away and came to rest at Elias's boot. Suspicion tightened Elias's jaw before he had time to speak. He kept his lantern tilted, the circle of light catching the trunk's worn leather and a smear of damp on the brass fittings. The maid's skirts brushed past the doorway and she froze, her hands lifted as if caught mid-task. "Thomas." Elias, steadying his voice, "What is that trunk?" Elias had arrived at Grimwood because the rain had driven him off the road. He had not expected secrecy. He had not expected a key to fall at his feet or a maid to look guilty. He thought of the scrap he'd unfolded at the dining table 2 nights earlier, "Do not go down at moonrise," and the warning stung his ears anew. Suspicion settled into his limbs and pushed him forward. He took one step closer, fingers already reaching for the key. Thomas' hand closed on the ladder rung, and he did not look up. "Don't touch that, Thomas." His voice was low. The lantern light carved a hard line across his face, Put it back where it belongs. Elias saw Thomas' thumb on a leather cord, the motion quick and practiced. The key lay between Elias's boots and the hatch like an accusation. Lady Isabel's shoes whispered on the corridor boards. Her presence arrived without preface. She stood in the doorway with her fan folded in one hand and her other hand resting on the banister. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, and the words cut through the landing. She did not glance at Elias as a stranger. Her eyes went straight to the trunk. Elias lifted the key with 2 fingers. "A key dropped," he said plainly. "I meant no intrusion." He kept his wrist stiff. He could hear his pulse in the quiet between voices. The landing smelled of wet wool and wax. The maid's face avoided Lady Isabel's gaze. Thomas' shoulders tensed like a man waiting for a blow. Lady Isabel drew herself up. "You will put that back, Thomas," she said. Her voice was calm. "And you, Morton, will step away," his name with measured courtesy and a cold edge beneath it. Elias felt his suspicion shift into irritation. He had sought shelter and been granted guarded hospitality. Now the household treated him like an intruder. He folded his lips and kept his palms empty. When Thomas moved to replace the key, his fingers slipped. The trunk lid opened a breath. Elias could not help himself. He stooped and pried the lid slightly with a thumb. Damp cloth and a rusted locket stared back, pressed into a nest of coarse linen. Elias' mouth went dry. The locket's chain had a single hair, dark and knotted, and the scent of oil and old dust rose from the case. Thomas' face went hard. "You had no right," he said, voice low and hurried. He reached for the trunk and Elias stepped back only when Thomas' hand hovered above the lid. "Lady Isabel." Isabel's fan tapped once against her palm. "Thomas," she said. "Close it." Her words were a command that did not tremble. She bent to look at Elias only for a moment, as if deciding whether he would be useful or dangerous. "There are things in this house that must not be shown to strangers at moonrise." The phrase cut across the landing. It was not a poetic warning, it was a factual order. Elias swallowed and the irritation narrowed into resolve. "Why must they be kept hidden?" he asked. "I have no quarrel with your house. I sought only shelter from the storm." He spoke plainly. He kept his voice steady because Lady Isabel's composure made the servants flinch. The maid pressed her lips together and let her gaze drop to the stairwell. Thomas' jaw worked. "Because the house keeps its own hours," he said. "Because some things are safer sealed." He glanced at the maid, then at the hatch, and the expression on his face altered. Loyalty turned inward, hard as bark. Elias could sense the change in Thomas, suspicion to guarded protectiveness. He understood then that Thomas' loyalties were not to Lady Isabel alone, but to the estate and a code of obedience. A maid stepped closer and pressed something into Elias's palm, a folded scrap of paper. He unfolded it. The same words he had seen before, written in a hurried hand, met his eyes. "Do not go down at moonrise." The maid's thumb traced the corner. "She me to hide it," she whispered. "She if I did not, Thomas would." Her voice caught. She would not finish the sentence. Her fingers trembled. Elias felt the suspicion curl into concern and then into a kind of necessity. He had to see what was kept beneath the hatch. The trunk with the locket proved the cellar was not merely for coal and cider. The damp fabric suggested human care. The maid's trimmer suggested fear. He looked at Lady Isabel. "Let me see," he said. "If there is danger or a person in need, I cannot stand aside." He kept his words simple and direct. Lady Isabel's pale blue eyes narrowed. "Mr. Morton, you must obey the house's rules. We have no obligation to justify them to guests. Thomas, seal the trunk and return it to the pantry." Her hand lifted an inch as if feeling the weight of authority. Then she lowered it and added, softer, "And see that the maid retires." The maid's shoulders folded. She ducked away, leaving the landing quieter by the scrape of skirts. Thomas obeyed at once, but his obedience was a slow movement. He replaced the key and closed the trunk. Still, he did not put the trunk down with the ease of routine. He held it as if the thing within might shift the balance of decisions. Elias watched Thomas' hands. They were broad, rough, steady in work. They betrayed a tenderness where the rest of him was blunt. Elias had come to Grimwood with a worn satchel and a pocket watch. He did not have a title. He had a steady curiosity, That curiosity told him the trunk's contents mattered. It him that a chain and a hair were not mere trinkets but testimony. He moved toward the spiral staircase anyway, ignoring Lady Isabel's flush of displeasure. Thomas cut in front of him. "You will not go down, Thomas." He it without flourish, his mouth set in a line, "Not at moonrise." Elias felt the word moonrise sharpen into dread. The maid's earlier warning gathered in the corridor like an accusation of trespass. They exchanged words rapidly then. "Elias, Thomas, listen to me. If there is someone hurt, we cannot leave them," Thomas answered. "If there is someone, it's for the house to keep Elias." "But the house cannot be the only judge, Thomas. You are a guest. You do not know what you have stumbled into, Elias. I know a man when I see a man protecting something he will not name the back," and forth lasted 5 short lines. The tempo rose. A small argument became a test. Lady Isabel's voice sliced through enough. She placed herself between them with that subtle, aristocratic posture she wore so naturally. "Miss Morton, you will remain in the front parlor until morning. Thomas will see that you are given a bed. No one descends tonight." Her hand moved to the banister with the ease of practiced authority. Elias caught a flash of fatigue in her eyes, lines that were not supposed to be visible. He made a decision then. He waited until footsteps receded and the parlor door eased closed. The maid still hovered at the foot of the stairs. She glanced at Elias, then at Thomas, and then slipped him a look that said more than words. Elias folded the scrap into his palm and let the suspicion harden into determination. He had to know who the hair belonged to. He had to understand why the house moved like a single, secret creature at moonrise. The spiral staircase smelled of tallow and cold stone. Elias held his lantern high and watched the narrow steps bite away the light. His breath came steady. The scrap of paper rustled against his finger. He moved down with measured steps. The house made small noises around him, footsteps in distant rooms, the creak of settling beams, a door closed slowly. At the cellar mouth he paused. The iron hatch swung up on chains and the smell of earth rose. Damp stone, old straw, a trace of something floral and cloying, lavender and dust. Elias' hand found the iron rung and he descended. The steps were slick with mud. He placed his weight deliberately and listened for the sound of other feet. Below, the chamber opened like a small room carved from the earth. Oil lamps sat on brackets and the light pooled in shallow puddles. A child's cot leaned against the far wall. Damp toys lay clustered in a corner. There was a small portrait propped against a crate. The same face as Lady Isabel's when she was young, though the painting's varnish had cracked with age. Elias' heart tightened. The evidence tied the objects to the Grimwood line. He bent and ran a finger along the tiny shoes. The fabric stuck to his skin. He smelled the oil and something sweeter like rose water. A fresh footprint marred the stone near the cot, recent, the heel printing crisp as if in wet clay. Elias straightened so quickly he nearly knocked the lamp. The footprint changed the room from relic to scene. Someone had been here very recently. A sound made him turn. A figure moved in the shadow beyond the cot, a pale face lifted from dimness. The woman stepped out with slow, deliberate motions. Her skin was almost the same porcelain as Lady Isabel's, but her eyes were dark and watchful. She did not speak at first. Thomas' voice came from the top of the stairs, urgent and rough. "Get back!" Thomas barreled down the steps. He struck past Elias and reached for the woman in a single, practiced movement that was more a holding than an attack. "You shouldn't be here," Thomas to the woman, and his voice had a sharp edge that had not been there before. The woman flinched but did not flee. Elias saw then a tenderness in Thomas that was sudden and raw. His hands were not cruel. They gripped to steady. Lady Isabel's voice reached them from above, high and brittle. "Thomas, come up. Mr. Morton, remain here by the hatch." Now, she did not come down. She stayed at the lip of authority and spoke through the corridor as if expecting obedience. The household's secrecy tightened and a new danger rushed in. Authority against curiosity, guardianship against exposure. The woman stepped closer to the cot. She held out the locket Elias had seen in the trunk. "They leave it out for the moon," she said in a voice that was thin but clear. "They say the light will keep the thing at bay." Her words were strange and specific. Elias's suspicion became bewilderment. He reached for an explanation and found only fragments in the woman's manner, habit, ritual, obeisance. Thomas' hand shook when he took the locket. His mouth worked. Lady Isabel's voice, low now, threaded down the stairs. "Thomas," she said, "bring him up. Now, seal the hatch. We will speak of this in the morning." There was no debate left. Thomas lifted his chin and obeyed. He turned to Elias, and for the first time his guard slipped into open fatigue. Elias did not step away. Thomas, let me look at the portrait." "Whose room is this?" He kept his voice steady. He needed names, not evasion. Thomas hesitated. "It belonged to my miss. She—" He halted and let the words die. He did not continue to say whether miss meant a child lost, a wife hidden, or a shame to be held. Lady Isabel's silhouette hovered above like a seal. "You will not pry at family grief, Miff Moreton," she said. "It would be cruel and unwelcome." Elias felt something like anger flare up. He thought of the fallen key, the trunk, the maid's warning, the footprint. He thought of the woman who had emerged from shadow to hold out that locket. He understood that the house sheltered a human being, and that the household had chosen silence over explanation. A sudden noise tore through the chamber. The front door slammed. The sound was precise and loud. For a moment all movement froze. The maid's whisper turned to a sharp intake. Thomas swore under his breath. Lady Isabel's posture altered. Someone outside banged on the door twice, quick and deliberate. The sound was unlike wind. It carried intention. "Who is there?" Lady Isabel called, voice now high with real alarm. Boots scuffed on the gravel outside and then receded. There was a hesitation, a pause, then a lighter tread as if someone had decided to leave. The knock left a residue of threat. Elias' attention snapped like a wire. He had thought the danger lay only in what the house hid. Now it might be approaching from the path. Thomas moved with speed. He took the woman by the elbow and guided her toward the steps. Elias stepped in front. "I'll go up with you," he said. "If the house is threatened from outside, we should stand together." His words were simple. He laid a hand on the woman's shoulder and felt a tremor pass through her. She clung to the locket as if it anchored her. At the top of the stairs, Lady Isabel waited with the maid. Her expression showed a fracture between command and exhaustion. "Do not touch the locket," she told them, "and do not speak of what you have seen. We have proved tonight the house must keep certain hours." Her voice contained weariness now. Elias realized she had been holding this posture for years. They argued for a few quick lines in the corridor. "Elias, Lady Isabel, names matter. Who is she?" "Lady Isabel, you will not drag this into the assembly rooms. It is not for gossip." "Elias, gossip is not my aim. If she is in danger, Lady Isabel." No more. The exchange lasted only 4 lines, rapid and clipped, each sentence cut to the next. Thomas guided the woman toward a small chamber beyond the pantries. He locked the door. The maid turned the keys in her hands until her knuckles whitened. Elias stood by the stair and watched the lock click. The house resealed itself. The maid's gaze met his and she mouthed, "Forgive me." Elias only shook his head. He felt the night's tide pull at him. Suspicion had moved to curiosity and then to alarm. Now it finally settled into resolve. He had seen the footprint, the portrait, the child's things, the locket, and the hidden woman. He had overheard Lady Isabel's commands and Thomas' loyalty. He understood that the house kept someone alive in secrecy, and that secrecy held a danger that could spill outward. Elias crossed to the front hall and found his satchel. He wrapped his oilskin cloak across his shoulders. The maid paused at the threshold and slid him another folded scrap. The same warning, quieter this time. "Beware the watchers." Elias felt a new emotion surge, protective determination. He would not be content to leave without knowing the truth and ensuring the woman's safety. As he stepped onto the porch, Thomas came up behind him, not blocking the door, but close enough to be a presence. "You cannot move without us seeing you, Thomas." His voice had an edge of pleading now. "You must let the house be as it must." Elias turned. "Thomas, I do not seek to harm the house. I seek to keep a person from vanishing into its rules." They held each other's gaze for a moment. Thomas' face showed a tired conflict. At last he nodded once. The night air hit Elias's face. The manor's windows glowed like expectant eyes. Somewhere in the distance, the iron gate rattled, once more a reminder that the world beyond Grimwood could be blunt and small. Lady Isobel stood on the landing, her hand on the banister, and for a beat she looked less like a matriarch and more like a woman weighed by a decision. "Tomorrow we will speak plainly," she said. "Tonight we seal what must be sealed." The sentence was a settlement. Elias felt the chapter close around him. He had come for shelter and found a household that kept a person hidden beneath its floorboards. He had watched this household decide in a few tight exchanges to protect that person by command and threat. He had seen Thomas go from blunt guardian to something resembling mercy. He had heard Lady Isobel's control fracture into fatigue. He had one piece of evidence in his pocket, folded and damp, and another in his memory. A footprint that proved someone had been below moments before. Those concrete items, paper, footprint, locket, were not metaphors. They were a ledger of what the house chose to protect. Elias closed the parlor door behind him and set his lantern on the table. He could not unsee the woman's face. He could not unhear the knock that had come and gone at the front door. He resolved to stay a little longer at Grimwood, to ask gentle questions, to press where he could without breaking the household entirely. He would begin by asking the maid more tomorrow, and by watching Thomas carefully. He would ask Lady Isobel for the truth in the morning light, when the house's need for secrecy might lift. Outside, a wind struck the iron gate. Inside, someone moved in the pantry. Elias set his satchel by the bed and lay down with his clothes on. He kept his pockets empty but for the folded scrap and the key that had been returned. He listened to the house breathe. He counted the sounds. A kettle on the stove, a soft footfall in the corridor, the faint shuffle of linen. He did not sleep fully. He tried not to imagine what the woman in the cellar had meant by leaving the locket for the moon. At midnight, a light in the west wing went out. At 1 in the morning, the front door was bolted. At 2, the house settled into a vigilant hush. Elias felt his resolve knit with the household's secrecy. He would not force a collapse, but he would not walk away either. He would gather evidence, he would ask questions, and he would keep watch for the men who might come back to the gate. Later that night, as the house seemed to breathe once more under the moon, a soft, metallic rasp sounded behind the pantry door, the latch turning, then a small knock. Elias sat upright. He had not expected visitors. He slid the parlor door open and peered down the corridor. The maid stood there, her face pale and set, holding a candle. She met his eyes and mouthed, "Come." Elias took his cloak and followed her to the pantry, where Thomas waited with a single oil lamp. He looked at Elias and then down the stair to the locked inner chamber. "She needs bread, sir." Thomas simply and quiet. Elias gathered the lamp. They moved as one, 2 guardians and 1 intruder, now allied by choice. Outside, wind brushed the hill. Inside, hands moved brisk and careful. In the locked chest of the manor, in the mouth of a cellar, a woman clutched a locket and listened for the sound of steps. Above them, Lady Isobel sat alone and smoothed her gloves until the fabric lay flat. She did not yet name the past that kept her family together and quiet. But she had ordered that the hatch be resealed. She had locked a door, and for tonight the house decided its own measure of safety. Elias crossed the threshold into the pantry and, with Thomas at his side and the maid's steady presence, began the small task of bringing bread down the stairs. The house held its breath and let the moonlight keep watch. Elias grabbed the hatch rim as a crate slid past his fingers, and Thomas swore, the moon catching the movement like an accusation. Suspicion tightened Elias's jaw. He held his lantern higher and saw Lady Isobel in the curtained window, her hand pressed to the glass. The scrap of paper he had read at the dining table, "Do not go down at moonrise," folded itself in his mind against that image. He had felt the brass key clatter at his boot weeks ago. Now the hatch moved under a pair of hands he knew by sight. He stepped forward and called, "Stop that, Thomas, what is that crate?" The call came out steady because Elias kept his voice measured when his suspicion needed to look like command. He knew shelter had turned to question the moment he crossed the iron gate, and he had not expected to end the night prying at locked doors. The central problem sat plain. The household sent things into the cellar at moonrise, and some living secret hid beneath Grimwood. If he let it be, someone would remain hidden by force. If he exposed it, he would strip the household of its careful protections. Elias shoved the hatch wider, and the terrace air smelled of wet stone and lamp oil. He remembered the folded scrap again, not as a memory but as evidence left in other hands. "Do not go down at moonrise," the maid had mouthed when she pushed the paper across Thomas' palm in the kitchen. Elias had kept it folded in his coat. Now the paper belonged to a house with a rhythm dictated by the moon. Thomas's shoulders stiffened on the terrace. He wore his heavy leather gloves and the battered lantern swung against his hip. "Elias," at Thomas' voice low, "you shouldn't be out here. Neither should you, Thomas." "Stop lowering it." Elias used the man's name to keep the line clear. The crate scraped the hatch and emitted a muffled clack. From the shadowed window, Lady Isabel stepped back. Her throat moved against the jet brooch. She nothing, but Elias watched her fingers leave a pale print on the glass. Her hesitation made public what the crate's presence already suggested. The household performed secrecy rather than explained it. They moved toward the servants, landing like three different answers to the same question. On the stair, a maid appeared with damp aprons and wide eyes. She placed the folded scrap on the banister with hands that trembled just enough to display fear without breaking into hysteria. "Mr. Morton," she said, voice thin, "please, it's the moon." Thomas cut her off. "Listen to me. Go back to your duties." He kept his sentences short and held his gaze on Elias. "Thomas, why are you taking things down?" Elias, and the words carried the weight of accusation. Thomas' reply was a brace of blunt practicality and something else that kept rising in his voice. Loyalty with a crack in it, not things a person. "Don't be foolish, Elias. You'll make trouble." That exchange shifted Elias' suspicion toward anger. He stepped so close the lantern light made the plants on his coat show like flat shapes. "A person. Elias, a person hidden in a cellar. Thomas, you put a trunk down there last week. The brass key rolled to my boot. Tell me the truth." Lady Isabel moved along the landing with the slow, precise gait of someone measuring each step. Her voice stayed, controlled but thin. "You will not drag our family through the road, Mir. Morton." She used his full surname and placed it between them like a shield. "We have reasons." Elias felt the emotion inside him shift again. Suspicion to impatience to a sharper, uneasy compassion. He had come for shelter and a night's rest. The shift toward curiosity and then toward protective indignation now drove him. He did not want to punish a family's careful choices, but he could not leave someone confined because a household wished to preserve reputation. The maid's hands found the banister, and she said the single line that had haunted him since Chapter 3. "Do not go down at moonrise." She repeated the words slower, like a warning handed from mouth to mouth. Her lips trembled. "It changes them, sir. That is why we hide it." Elias' grip tightened on the lantern. He pressed a palm against the hatch's edge and felt the splinters. "Who is it?" he demanded. Thomas answered with a clipped refusal. "No names," he said. "No gossip. You leave this house tonight and forget you saw anything." Elias' reaction was not a speech. He set the lantern on the landing, pouching the light between boards, and reached for the hatch with both hands. His fingers dug at the iron ring. His breath came even. This was the choice he had promised to make when he stepped through Grimwood's gate. Shelter or exposure. His decision now would decide which life he would disturb. He pried the hatch. The boards gave with a dull groan and revealed a narrow stair marked with fresh scuffing and traces of damp shoe leather. The smell that rose was close and domestic. Starch, mended cloth, a child's talc beneath a covering of stale air. The trunk was gone. The stair looked used in the last hours. Lady Isabel's composure thinned. She placed a gloved hand flat on the newel post, and then folded her fingers tight. "Elias," she said, voice small, "whatever you think you will find, do not be cruel." Elias's voice dropped. "Cruelty's already here, Lady Isabel. If this is a person living in that room, you are hiding them. That is different from keeping family secrets. We protect family. Mir. Morton. Thomas, you do not know what it costs." The maid's face crumpled. "They change when the moon is up." She blurted, "They start to cry and then they rage. We sleep in shifts. We close doors, please." Elias turned to her. Her pupils were wide and wet, paint smudged on the cuff of her sleeve. The concrete detail, the scrap, the brass key, the trunk lowered weeks before, fell into place. Someone in the household had been kept below and moved at moonrise to keep them from breaking. This was not merely concealment for reputation. It was containment for something that reacted to the moon. He pushed the lantern down the stair and then followed the light. The stair tightened around him like a throat. It smelled of damp cloth and the faint metallic hint of old buttons. Thomas descended ahead of him, lantern bobbing, and Lady Isobel lingered at the top with her shawl pressed to her breast. On the landing below, the cellar door stood open. Elias' heart picked up a cadence of alertness. He felt neither poetic dread nor hazy fear, only a precise tightening at the base of his palms. The scrap that had once warned him sat on the table above. Now the table held a child's shoe and a portrait in a cracked frame. The portrait was small, a round face and cropped hair, the kind of likeness that meant a child's presence had once been part of daily domestic life. The hidden room smelled of starch and lavender, and a pile of faded garments lined a shelf. A little chair with a nicked armrest waited in the center. Elias touched the chair's worn edge and felt the imprint of another weight. "This is where they kept them," he said, voice even. "Who is they?" Lady Isobel's composure broke. Her voice hit a brittle edge and lost its aristocratic smoothness. "My brother's child," she said. "We lost them from the house after the fever. The doctors said the child was delicate. We could not let the gossip of the county take them. We kept them hidden. Thomas tended them. Thomas's voice, rough and sudden, cut in. "We did what we had to. We kept them safe." Elias' mind registered names and ties. Lady Isobel's brother, child kept in the cellar, servants who spoke of change when the moon rose. The concrete twist came then. A small, pale figure stirred at the doorway of the hidden room and stepped into the lantern light. The figure's hair hung in thin wisps, and the face carried an age beyond the years painted in the portrait. The person's eyes were watchful, too watchful, and the skin drew the lantern glow into pale planes. They did not speak. They stood with a folded blanket clutched against their chest, as if a single thread of cloth was all that separated them from the room's dim corners. Elias felt the emotion in him shift again, curiosity to unease to an urgent, protective clarity. He took one slow step forward, palms open. "Who are you?" he asked. The figure's voice was small. "I am called May," they said. They asked the moon an answer in the dark. May's words did not clarify. They announced odd syntax instead. The maid cried out and stepped forward, touching May's shoulder with a rough, immediate tenderness. "May, you mustn't tea." Thomas moved like a hand closing over something dear. "Back." "Elena," he said to the maid, using her name with blunt command, "back to the kitchen." Now Elias looked at Lady Isobel. "Why keep May in the cellar?" he demanded. Lady Isobel's lips shook. "She was fragile after the fever. People would have taken her from us. We could not. And at moonrise." Elias pressed. "Why move her then?" Lady Isobel looked away. She wept and she screamed. The neighbors would hear. Thomas and I thought. A Thomas's gloved hand closed on the lantern. "We thought to save her the shame of being gossiped about, Elias. We kept her from the road. If you expose this, you will ruin her." Elias's jaw worked. He measured the stakes. The child's safety against the truth. The emotional pattern tightened. He recognized that the household had traded daily honesty for containment. He could not accept that a person should be turned into a secret to placate a county's appetite for scandal. May's gaze fixed on Elias. Their eyes tracked him like a small animal watching for a leader. Without flourish, May reached forward and touched Elias's sleeve. The skin was cool and the touch small but direct. The motion made Elias' heart shift from argument to tenderness. "May," he said, "do you want to leave this room?" May's mouth pulled at the corners. "I do not leave when the moon is up. I sleep in the night and wake when the pains go quiet. But when the moon is bright, my head bursts and I hit and I shout. Thomas brings me blankets. Lady Isobel sings to me softly. I do not mean to frighten." Elias' voice softened, though he kept his posture firm. You will not be punished for that here. Not by me. A sound came from the stair above. The iron gates half turned somewhere in the manor, and the world outside the cellar registered as distant. The argument that had begun with suspicion ballooned into an urgent moral problem. Continued concealment harmed May, but exposure risked forcing her into a world that had shown little patience. Elias recognized that decisions made by Lady Isabel and Thomas were driven by shame, not malice. That distinction mattered. Thomas' hands fumbled at a pocket and produced a small brass key, the one Elias had found earlier by his boot. The sight of it clattered the room back into focus. We move her at moonrise because the light makes her restless. Thomas. We take her aside and keep her from windows where she will hurt herself. We are careful. Elias felt anger flare into a different current, frustration giving way to determination. He stepped between Thomas and May and set the lantern on a crate. We can find help, he said, not explanations, help. A doctor or a house away from gossip. You cannot go on moving a person as if she were furniture. Lady Isabel's hands folded together. Where would we take her? She asked, who would accept her? Who will trust us? Elias heard the fear behind the question. But answers came with action. He would not cast the family into ruin by simple exposure. He would instead press them into change. Let me ride at dawn, he said. I'll speak to an apothecary in the village. I'll find someone who knows how to care for May without making her a spectacle. Thomas' reaction was immediate and fierce. You would go to the village. You would show our worst to strangers. His voice had a sharp edge of protection that nearly broke into violence. Elias held his ground. I will not take her from you without consent. I will ask. But I will not stand aside while you move a person like a crate. The argument that followed tightened into the required rapid back and forth. You do not understand, Thomas. Thomas, name yourself, Lady Isabel interjected, voice trembling. Name myself. Thomas snapped, you know my name. I know mine. We keep this house, Thomas. Elias, lo, tell me what happens when the moon is full. She cries at the windows and claws the glass. Thomas. She begs the moon to let her be. She wakes the house. You think I like locking a child? No, Elias replied. I done tea. He paused. But I will not let you hide her from the world forever. At that moment, a noise from the hidden chamber, soft and then sharp, cut through them. May flinched, then moved with animal speed. She lurched forward and her fist struck the lantern, sending it tilting. Flame licked the landing's edge and Thomas lunged to steady it. Elias' reflex was to catch the lantern and move it back to safety. The flame reflected in May's eyes like a second moon. She recoiled and then lashed out. A thin plate fell from a shelf and struck the floor with a sound like a small gunshot. For an instant the room went raw with motion. Thomas's broad shoulder stepping between May and the stair. Lady Isabel's hand covering her mouth. The maid Elena rushing forward, then stopping as Thomas raised a hand. The mini cliffhanger landed there. May's sudden strike had revealed how thin the barrier was between care and harm. It forced the household into immediate action. Elias felt the urgency surge. Either they contained the moment and left May as before, or they turned this raw movement into a chance to change things. Elias took the decision. He moved closer and crouched to May's level. May, he said softly, hold my hand. Look at me. May stared a long moment. Then, after a breath, she placed her small fingers in his. The contact steadied the tremor in her shoulders. Thomas lowered his hand, but did not look relieved. He watched Elias with a rough, measuring gaze. Hours passed in compressed motions. Elias organized blankets and found water in a chipped basin. He kept talking to May with short sentences and slow cadence. Name the village. I will find a doctor. Stay here tonight. I will not take you without your will. He the last line, because he intended it. Lady Isabel moved among the garments with trembling hands, pulling out a faded frock that matched the portrait Mrs. Grimwood had shown him earlier. She sat on the small chair and began to sing a tune that had once been for a crib. The sound was small and specific, a melody with places to breathe, and it made May's shoulders loosen. Thomas stood at the doorway, lantern in hand, watching each motion like a man learning new steps. At Prue Dawn, after long hours of small, concrete care, Elias harnessed his mare. He had not slept properly. He smelled faintly of mended shirts and starch. Lady Isobel came to the gate and clasped his hand in a formal, clumsy hold. She did not say the things a lady of her station might say about gratitude. Instead, she touched Elias' sleeve and looked him in the eye. "If you fail to find help, if the village turns us away, promise me you will not expose her out of spite. Promise me you will find a better way." Elias answered with action, not speech. He nodded. The decision to ride at dawn meant he would carry their secret into public rooms that measured worth with flat judgments. He also knew that some truths required risk. On the road, the manor receded into a wedge of silhouette. Elias rode with the scrap folded in his pocket and the brass key warm in his palm. He stopped at the apothecary and gave the owner one clear sentence. "I need someone who cares for children like May. She cannot be mocked. She must be kept safe, and she must be free when she can be free." The apothecary studied him, then agreed to visit Grimwood that evening if Elias could bring a doctor from the county. When Elias returned to the gate, dawn slid pale and ordinary across the lane. The household had bound the night's small wounds with terry cloth and quiet words. Thomas stood by the coach house, hands folded, posture tight as a man who had slept with his boots on. Lady Isobel met Elias at the door with a shawl wrapped closer about her shoulders. In the cellar, May sat by the little chair and held the blanket tight. The maid Elena arranged a cup of warm milk on the table. The room felt changed because of action. Decisions had been made and tasks assigned. Elias watched Thomas bend and tie May's shoe with a care that had not been visible in the earlier hours. The man's rough hands trembled and left a smudge of dirt on the child's stocking. The motion made Elias realize Thomas' secrecy had worn the shape of tenderness. Later that afternoon, the apothecary and a county doctor arrived. They examined May with hands that were methodical and concrete, checking pulse, listening to breathing, testing reflexes with a small hammer. The doctor asked direct questions and then suggested a regimen of care and a trained nurse who had worked with children suffering after fevers. The apothecary recommended daily linen changes and a plan to move May gradually into a daylight room with shutters and close supervision. They did not promise cures of fancy. They offered steps and names and a willingness to vouch. When the doctor's pen scratched across the notepad, the practical solution formed. May would remain at Grimwood under professional care, with a nurse employed from the village and medical oversight recorded, not hidden. The solution did not erase the shame. Lady Isobel signed the agreement with a hand that quivered, and Thomas stood nearest the doorway to the cellar, as if guarding its threshold. But the decision changed the householder's shape. Secrecy gave way to recorded care, and that shift mattered. That evening, when the moon had not yet risen but hung like a promise, Thomas and Lady Isobel walked with Elias to the terrace hatch. They stood together while May sat on the top step, clutching her blanket. Elias could see the strain in each of them. A lifetime of silence had left lines on the face, and a protective edge to each movement. May Lady Isobel, soft and steady, "The nurse comes tomorrow. You will have a room with a shutter and a lamp at night. You will not be moved at moonrise without reasons we all understand. Do you understand?" May nodded. Her breath was small. "I will try," they said. Thomas' voice broke. "I did what I thought right," he said. "Forgive me if you can." Elias placed a hand on Thomas' broad forearm. "Thomas," he said, "plain. You kept someone safe in the only way you knew. Now let us learn a better way." The moon rose that night, and for the first time in many turns, it failed to unmoor the household. They watched it together as a family doing the awkward work of rearranging itself. Lady Isobel at the window, a shawl tight at her throat. Thomas by the staircase, boots planted like a man learning to loosen his grip. Elena and the other maid carrying warm water. Elias standing by May with a lantern dimmed to a steady proof of presence rather than an interrogation. When the moon climbed higher, May made small noises in sleep and turned onto her side without striking out. The action showed what the doctor's plan aimed for. Steady routine, measured care, supervision that reduced the need for emergency moves. Elias felt a closing out of the night's conflict. The immediate threat had been addressed, and the arc of secrecy had transformed into a plan of care. In the dawn grey after the moonset, Elias walked to the manor gate. Lady Isabel presented a small package, a faded ribbon taken from the portrait's frame, and pressed it into his hand. "For May, when you return with the nurse," she said. Her voice steadied in the way of someone who had crossed a private threshold. Elias nodded. "I'll return with the nurse in 3 days," he said. He felt neither triumph nor easy relief. He felt a concrete, worn satisfaction. He had intervened with action, secured a plan that bound professionals to a household's care, and given May a chance at daylight. He mounted his mare and paused on the lane. At his saddle, he held the brass key he had once found at his boot. He set it back into his pocket as if to leave it where it belonged. He looked once at the manor's silhouette, its windows dark but not empty, and then rode away toward the village. As he passed under the iron gate, Alina called his name, and Thomas stepped to the gate and said plainly, "Elias, thank you." Elias did not answer with a speech. He tipped his hat, tightened the straps on his satchel, and rode out of Grimwood's reach. The road wound into the dawn, and the manor receded until only its profile remained. He felt the weight of the night's choices on his shoulders, but the burden now carried clear edges: names, appointments, a nurse due to arrive. The secret had stopped being furniture and become a plan in daylight. Before he turned fully away, Elias looked back once more. A figure at the top window lifted a hand in a small, uncertain gesture. He saw Lady Isabel's profile and Thomas' broad shadow in the doorway. May's pale face at the stair caught his last glance. The manor stayed silent and busy with its small, human repairs. Elias rode on toward the village, the brass key warm in his coat and the scrap of paper folded against his chest. He did not promise to return with triumph, only with practical care. The day's decisions had reconfigured the house. The moral question that had opened as secrecy and fear now held a path forward. Professional oversight, a registered nurse, and a household willing, at last, to stand in the open and change. Elias could not claim to have solved everything, but he had forced the household into a series of actions that would either sustain or break them. He had chosen to turn suspicion into measured help, and that choice would now be tested by the world outside Grimwood's gate. When the road bent and the manor fell from sight, Elias's stride remained even. He felt the motion of riding like a measure. He carried the night's weight not as a story, but as a set of tasks. He had come for shelter and found responsibility instead. He rode toward the apothecary's promise, and toward whatever would arrange May's proper care, leaving the manor to its lamps and the household to the work of rearranging secrets into documented steps. At the next lane, a cart passed with hay, and an honest farmer tipped his hat. Elias returned the salute. He kept the brass key and the scrap folded in his pocket as reminders of a night when secrecy nearly damaged a person. He knew the next hours would require him to speak and to bargain. He also knew that Lady Isabel and Thomas had chosen to let others into their household. That choice felt fragile, but it existed. It would be the measure of the family's honesty in the days ahead. The final decision had been made not in words alone, but in the listing of concrete actions. The doctor's visit, the nurse coming, the recorded plan. Elias had transformed suspicion into steps. He rode on with the small motions of a man whose night's rest was traded for the beginnings of care. And in that motion he held the proof that some secrets could be unhidden without ruin, if those who hid them would accept help. At the manor gate, Lady Isabel watched until he was gone. Thomas closed the gate behind him and felt the latch click the way a man feels a hinge settle. Inside, May slept beneath a lamp's steady glow. The household had not solved every problem. Old habits would return if they did not guard against them. But the night's events had forced them into new tasks and new names. Elias rode into the village with a plan and a promise of return. The night's reckoning at Grimwood had ended in decisions that bound people together by action, not silence. He had left the manor with a brass key, a folded scrap, and the knowledge that change required both courage and a willingness to invite others in. The road carried him away, and the manor remained to keep its lamps lit in the small, practical work of keeping a person safe. Outside the gate, the first sun struck the lane and leaned hot upon the road. Elias felt the warmth and rode toward it, his choices behind him and his next tasks ahead.